The gunshot echoed across the Wyoming prairie as Violet Fletcher stumbled forward, clutching her bloodied side while the horizon blurred before her eyes. She hadn't expected to die in a place so beautiful, golden grassland stretching toward distant mountains, painted crimson by the setting sun of 1878. Her stolen horse had long since bolted, leaving her alone with the wound from her pursuers' bullets and miles from anywhere that might be called civilization. When her knees finally buckled beneath her, she welcomed the fall, too exhausted to fight anymore. "Madam? Madam, can you hear me?" The voice seemed to come from another world entirely. Violet forced her eyes open, surprised to find herself staring up at the weathered face of a man with intense blue eyes. His expression was etched with concern as he knelt beside her, already examining her wound. "Leave me," she whispered, her throat parched. "They'll find you too." The man, a cowboy from the looks of his worn hat and trail-dusted clothes, ignored her warning. With gentle but firm hands, he tore a strip of fabric from his own shirt and pressed it against her side. "Bullet just grazed you. Deep, but not fatal if we clean it proper," he said, his voice low and steady. "Can you ride?" When Violet didn't respond, he carefully lifted her into his arms. The movement sent pain shooting through her body, and she gasped. "You'll regret saving me," she managed through clenched teeth. The cowboy settled her onto his horse before mounting behind her, one arm secure around her waist. "Only if you leave too soon," he replied, urging his horse forward as darkness fell across the prairie. Violet slipped in and out of consciousness, aware only of the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the stranger's warmth against her back. When she finally woke fully, she found herself in a small cabin. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across rough-hewn walls. She was lying on a narrow bed, her wound cleaned and bandaged. "You're awake." The cowboy stepped into view, carrying a cup of something steaming. "Thought I might lose you there for a bit." "Where am I?" Violet asked, attempting to sit up before pain forced her back down. "My place. Name's Victor Everett." He offered the cup. "It's just broth, but you need something in your stomach." Violet hesitated before accepting it. "Why help me? You don't know what I've done." "Don't much care, either." Victor pulled a chair beside the bed and sat. "Found a woman bleeding out on my land. That's all I needed to know." She studied him, tall and lean, with a face that had seen its share of sun and hardship. His dark hair was in need of a trim, and several days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw, but his eyes were kind in a way she hadn't seen in a long while. "I'm Violet," she said finally. "Violet Fletcher." "Well, Miss Fletcher, whatever trouble you're in, it can wait until you're healed." Violet wanted to argue, to tell him about the men who would be looking for her, men who wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who stood in their way. But exhaustion pulled at her, and before she could form the words, sleep claimed her once more. The next few days passed in a haze of pain and fever. Victor changed her bandages, brought her food, and sometimes simply sat beside her, reading aloud from one of the few books he owned. Violet learned he had been a rancher before the war, had fought for the Union, and now ran a modest cattle operation with just a handful of hands who were currently driving a small herd to the railhead in Cheyenne. "You live here alone?" she asked on the fourth day, when she was finally able to sit up without feeling like she might pass out. "Most of the time." Victor nodded, mixing something at the small table that served as both his desk and dining table. "Suits me fine." "No wife? No family?" A shadow crossed his face. "Had a wife once. Yellow fever took her and our boy back in '68. "I'm sorry," Violet said, and meant it. Victor brought over a cup containing a bitter-smelling liquid. "Willow bark tea. Help with the pain." As he passed it to her, their fingers brushed and Violet felt an unexpected warmth that had nothing to do with her fever. She quickly looked away. "Thank you," she murmured, "for everything. But once I'm able, I should move on." Those men still after you? Victor asked, settling back in his chair. Violet stared at him, startled. How did you talk in your sleep? His expression remained neutral. Don't know what you took from them, but they seem mighty determined to get it back. Shame and anger twisted in her chest. I didn't take anything that wasn't rightfully mine to begin with. Victor watched her for a long moment before nodding once. Fair enough. But whoever's chasing you, they're not likely to give up easy. No, Violet agreed quietly. They won't. Well then, Victor stood, stretching his tall frame. Guess we'd better make sure you're fit to ride when the time comes. For the next week, Violet slowly regained her strength. Victor helped her take short walks outside the cabin, supporting her when her legs threatened to give out. The Wyoming summer was in full bloom, painting the surrounding hills with wildflowers and turning the nearby creek into a ribbon of silver. During those walks, Violet learned about Victor's life, how he'd come west after the war, seeking something he couldn't quite name. How he'd built his small ranch from nothing, working himself nearly to death those first few years. He spoke little of his past sorrows, but they lingered in his eyes whenever he thought she wasn't looking. In turn, Violet found herself telling him pieces of her own story. Not everything, not the worst parts, but enough that he might understand why she couldn't stay. My father had a small silver claim near Virginia City, she explained one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Nothing grand, but it was promising. A man named Harlan Blackwell wanted it. When my father refused to sell, there was an accident in the mine. Victor didn't speak, but his hand found hers in the gathering darkness. After he died, I discovered Blackwell had forged documents claiming my father had sold him everything before the accident. I had nothing, not even proof that he'd been murdered. Her voice hardened. So, I took the only thing of value. I had left the map to a richer vein my father had discovered, but kept secret. And now Blackwell's men are after you, Victor concluded. Violet nodded. They caught up with me outside of Laramie. I managed to escape, but... She gestured to her wounded side. What will you do with the map? Find someone honest to work the claim. Split the profits. Violet looked out at the darkening landscape. Then disappear somewhere. Blackwell can't find me. Victor was quiet for so long that Violet wondered if she'd said too much. Finally, he squeezed her hand gently. You're welcome here as long as you need, he said. My men won't be back for another 3 weeks at least. Violet turned to face him, studying the strong lines of his profile against the last light of day. Why are you doing this? You don't owe me anything. His eyes met hers, and something passed between them that made her breath catch. Maybe I'm tired of being alone, he said simply. That night, Violet lay awake long after Victor had retired to his bedroll by the fire, having insisted she keep the only bed. She thought about the way he looked at her, not with pity or judgment, but with understanding. It had been so long since anyone had seen her, truly seen her, that she'd almost forgotten how it felt. In the morning, Victor announced he needed to check his fences and would be gone most of the day. He left Violet with a loaded rifle, just in case, and instructions to stay inside. I've been taking care of myself for years, she reminded him with a hint of irritation. Victor just smiled. I don't doubt it, but humor me. After he'd gone, Violet forced herself through a series of exercises, determined to regain her full strength. By midday, she was restless enough to venture outside despite Victor's warning. The June sun warmed her face as she carefully made her way to the small vegetable garden behind the cabin. Kneeling in the soft earth, she began pulling weeds, finding unexpected satisfaction in the simple task. She was so absorbed that she didn't hear the approaching riders until they were almost upon the cabin. Violet's heart slammed against her ribs as she scrambled to her feet. 3 men on horseback had stopped in the yard, and even from a distance, she recognized one of them, Jed Thornton, Blackwell's most ruthless hired gun. Moving as quietly as possible, She retreated to the cabin and grabbed the rifle Victor had left. Her hands trembled slightly as she checked that it was loaded. Through the window, she watched as the men dismounted and approached the door. "Hello, the house," Thornton called. "Anybody home?" Violet remained silent, the rifle ready. "We're just looking for a woman," another man said. "Dark hair, pretty. Might be injured. Seen anyone like that?" When no answer came, Thornton nodded to the third man, who drew his pistol and started toward the door. Violet took a deep breath, steadied the rifle against her shoulder, and fired a warning shot through the window. The bullet splintered wood near the man's feet, stopping him in his tracks. "Next one goes through something that won't heal," she shouted. "Get off this property." Thornton laughed, the sound chilling her blood.
Well, well.
"Miss Fletcher, fancy meeting you here." He took a step forward. "You've led us on quite a chase, but it ends today. Mr. Blackwell wants his map back." "It's not his map," Violet replied, her fingers steady on the trigger. "It never was." "Don't matter much now, does it?" Thornton's hand moved toward his holster. "You're outnumbered, and from what I hear, you're not exactly in fighting shape." The standoff seemed to stretch into eternity. Violet knew she could take one, maybe two if she was lucky, but not all three. And once the rifle was empty, the crack of another gunshot startled everyone. One of Thornton's men cried out, clutching his arm as blood seeped between his fingers. "She ain't alone," Victor's voice rang out from the edge of the clearing. He sat atop his horse, a smoking revolver in his hand and fury in his eyes. "And you boys are trespassing." Thornton spun toward the new threat, but Victor was already firing again, his shot knocking the gun from the second man's hand. "Next one kills," Victor warned, his voice cold as January ice. "Your choice." For a moment, Thornton seemed to consider his options. Then, slowly, he raised his hands. "Easy now. We're just doing a job. Your job brought you onto my land, threatening a guest under my protection." Victor's horse moved closer, the animal sensing its rider's tension. "That was a poor decision." Thornton glanced at his injured companions, then back at Victor. "Blackwell won't stop coming for her. Or the map." "Then Blackwell can come himself," Victor replied. "But he'd best bring more men than you." A tense silence followed, broken only by the wounded man's labored breathing. Finally, Thornton nodded. "We'll go. For now." His eyes narrowed. "But this ain't over." "For today it is," Victor said, his gun still trained on Thornton. "Now ride out, and don't look back." Violet kept the rifle aimed as the men mounted their horses, Thornton helping his wounded companion. As they rode away, she didn't lower the weapon until they had disappeared from sight. Only then did she realize she was shaking, the adrenaline leaving her body in a rush that made her knees weak. She sank to the floor, the rifle clattering beside her. Moments later, Victor burst through the door, his face tight with concern. "Violet, are you hurt?" She shook her head, unable to speak through the tightness in her throat. Victor knelt beside her, his hands gentle as they checked her for injuries anyway. "I'm fine," she finally managed. "How did you know?" "Saw their tracks crossing mine." Victor sat back on his heels, his breathing still fast. "Rode back as quick as I could." Violet reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "Thank you." Victor's eyes held hers, and for a heartbeat, neither moved. Then, almost hesitantly, he brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "I told you," he said softly. "You're under my protection." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was anything but. Violet felt something shift between them, a boundary crossed, a possibility acknowledged. "They'll come back," she whispered. "With more men." "I know." Victor helped her to her feet. "Which means we need to be ready." Over the next few days, Victor reinforced the cabin windows and created defensive positions around the property. He sent a message to his ranch hands, calling them back early from the cattle drive. Violet insisted on helping despite her still-healing wound, cleaning weapons, and keeping watch while Victor worked. In the evenings, exhausted but determined, they planned what to do when Blackwell's men returned. And in the quiet moments between preparation and sleep, they talked about their pasts, their losses, and the lonely paths that had led them to this moment. "I never thought I'd feel this again," Victor admitted one night as they sat before the fire, shoulders touching. "After Marie died, I figured that part of me was gone for good." Violet understood exactly what he meant, though she'd never had what he'd lost. Her life had been one of survival since her father's death, with no room for tenderness. "I've never had anyone fight for me before," she said quietly. "Not like you did." Victor turned to her, the firelight dancing across his features. "You're worth fighting for, Violet Fletcher." When he kissed her, it felt like coming home to a place she'd never been. His lips were gentle at first, questioning, then more insistent as she responded. Violet let herself be pulled into his embrace, her hands finding their way into his hair, her body arching toward his as if they'd been created to fit together. Later, tangled in the bedsheets, Victor traced the scar on her side with reverent fingers. "Does it still hurt?" "Not anymore," Violet murmured, drawing him down for another kiss. "Nothing hurts when I'm with you." For 2 precious weeks, they existed in a world of their own making. During the day, they prepared for the inevitable confrontation with Blackwell's men. At night, they discovered each other, learning the geography of scars and sensitive places, sharing whispered dreams that neither had dared voice before. Victor's ranch hands returned, for loyal men who didn't question why their boss was willing to fight for a woman he'd known less than a month. They simply added their guns and their resolve to the cause, setting up watch rotations and readying horses for quick escape if needed. "If things go bad," Victor told Violet as they lay together one night, "I want you to ride north with Tom. He knows a place where you can lie low until it's safe." Violet propped herself up on one elbow, studying his face in the moonlight streaming through the window. "I'm not leaving you to face Blackwell alone." "This isn't your fight anymore," he insisted. "It's ours. And I need to know you're safe." "My whole life, I've been running," Violet said, her voice fierce despite its softness. "I'm tired of it. Whatever happens, we face it together." Victor started to argue, then sighed, pulling her close instead. "Stubborn woman." "You wouldn't want me any other way," she replied, settling against his chest. They both knew Blackwell would come. The only question was when. The answer arrived 3 days later, with the dawn. Victor's youngest hand, barely 20 and with eyes that missed nothing, spotted dust on the horizon. Riders approaching, at least a dozen. "They're coming straight for us," he reported. No attempt to hide their approach. Victor nodded grimly. "They want us to see them, to be afraid." He looked at Violet. Last chance to ride out. She checked the revolver at her hip, one of Victor's that she'd become proficient with over the past weeks. Not a chance. The ranch hands took their positions too in the barn loft with rifles, one behind the well, and one with Victor and Violet in the cabin. They waited in tense silence as their riders drew closer, the thunder of hooves growing louder. Finally, the group reined to a halt about 50 yards from the cabin. At their center sat a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit, out of place among the rough gunmen surrounding him. "That's Blackwell," Violet whispered, her grip tightening on her weapon. Victor squeezed her shoulder reassuringly before stepping onto the porch, rifle in hand but pointed downward in a show of restraint if not submission. "This is private property," he called. "State your business." Blackwell urged his horse forward a few steps. "My business is with the woman you're harboring, Mr. Everett. I believe she has something that belongs to me." "Nothing here belongs to you," Victor replied evenly. "I suggest you turn around and ride out while you still can." A cold smile stretched across Blackwell's face. "I admire your loyalty, sir, Truly I do. But you're outnumbered, and Miss Fletcher is a thief. Hand her over with the map she stole, and you have my word no harm will come to you or your men. Your word isn't worth the air it takes to speak it, Violet said, stepping out beside Victor. You murdered my father and stole his claim. The map was mine by right. Blackwell's expression hardened. Your father was a fool who didn't recognize an opportunity when it presented itself. His death was unfortunate, but hardly murder. We both know that's a lie, Violet replied, her voice steady despite the rage coursing through her. Just like we both know that Vane is rich enough to make even you nervous about witnesses. A tense silence followed her words. Blackwell's men shifted uneasily, exchanging glances. Clearly, their employer hadn't shared all the details of this particular job. Enough of this, Blackwell snapped. He gestured to Thornton, who had taken position at his right hand. Get the map. Kill anyone who interferes. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Thornton raised his rifle, aiming not at Victor but at Violet. Victor shoved her aside just as the shot rang out, the bullet splintering wood where she had stood. From the barn and well, Victor's men opened fire, their shots precise and devastating in the first volley. 2 of Blackwell's men fell immediately. The others scattered for cover, returning fire wildly. Victor pulled Violet back into the cabin as bullets thudded into the walls around them. Stay down, he ordered, moving to a window to return fire. For what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, the air filled with gun smoke and the deafening crack of rifles. Through a gap in the curtains, Violet saw one of Victor's men stumble from behind the well, clutching his leg. Before Blackwell's men could finish him, she aimed her revolver through the window and fired, hitting the nearest attacker in the shoulder. We need to end this before someone else gets hurt, Victor said, ducking back to reload. Violet nodded toward the back door. If I can circle around, I might be able to get to Blackwell. Victor's face darkened. Too dangerous. He won't expect it, she insisted. And his men are focused on the front. Before Victor could argue further, a cry from outside drew their attention. Through the window, they saw Blackwell seizing the opportunity amid the chaos. He had broken from his men and was racing toward the barn, where the saddlebags containing the map were stored. He's going for the map, Violet gasped. Without hesitation, Victor charged out the front door, firing as he ran toward the barn. Violet followed, her heart in her throat as bullets kicked up dust around them. They reached the barn seconds after Blackwell, finding him frantically searching through the tack room. When he saw them, he drew a small derringer from his coat pocket. Stay back, he warned, aiming the weapon at Victor. It's over, Blackwell, Victor said, his rifle trained on the man's chest. Your men are either dead or running. Drop the gun. For a moment, it seemed Blackwell might comply. Then his eyes hardened, and he swung the derringer toward Violet. Victor fired first. Blackwell crumpled, the small pistol falling from his grasp unfired. His expression was one of genuine surprise as he looked down at the spreading crimson stain on his expensive waistcoat. You shot me, he said, his voice faint with disbelief. You left us no choice, Violet replied, kneeling beside him. Blackwell's eyes found hers, hatred giving way to something like resignation. The map would have made me the richest man in the territory. It wasn't yours to claim, she said softly. With a final, rattling breath, Harlan Blackwell died not in his mansion surrounded by wealth, but in a dusty barn at the hands of those he'd underestimated. Outside, the gunfire had ceased. Victor helped Violet to her feet, and together they emerged to find Thornton and the remaining gunmen surrendering to Victor's ranch hands. Mr. Blackwell won't be joining you, Victor informed them coldly. Your choice now is simple: right away and never return or join him. Thornton looked from Victor to the armed ranch hands, then to the bodies of his fallen comrades. Without a word, he turned and walked to his horse. The others followed suit, helping their wounded mount before riding away in defeat. In the aftermath, they assessed the damage. Miraculously, none of Victor's men had been killed, though 2 had injuries that would need tending. The cabin and barn had taken the worst of it, with bullet holes peppering the structures. As the adrenaline faded, Violet found herself trembling. Victor pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "It's finally over." That night, after the wounded had been tended and Blackwell's body prepared for transport to the nearest town, Victor and Violet sat on the porch steps, watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. "What will you do now?" Victor asked quietly. "With the map, I mean." Violet leaned against his shoulder, exhausted but more at peace than she'd been in years. "What I always planned. Find someone honest to work the claim, split the profits." She looked up at him. "Unless you know a rancher who might be interested in expanding his business interests." Victor's smile was slow but radiant. "I might. The silver would provide security," she continued. "For the ranch. For the future." "Our future?" Victor asked, his voice careful. Violet turned fully toward him, taking his weathered hands in hers. "When I first met you, I said you'd regret saving me. And I said only if you left too soon," he reminded her, his eyes searching hers. "I'm not leaving," she promised. "Not ever, if you'll have me." Victor's answer came not in words, but in the gentle press of his lips against hers, a kiss that held the promise of mornings and evenings stretching into years, of a love born in danger, but destined to thrive in peace. 1 year later, they stood on that same porch, watching as workers completed the expansion of the cabin, now a proper ranch house with enough room for the family they hoped to build. The silver mine had proved even richer than Violet's father had suspected, providing the means to grow Victor's ranch into one of the most prosperous in the territory. "Happy?" Victor asked, his arm around his wife's waist. Violet leaned into his embrace, thinking of how far they'd come from that blood-soaked evening on the prairie. "More than I ever thought possible." As the Wyoming sun set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Victor Everett offered a silent thanks to the twist of fate that had brought her, wounded and desperate, to the one man who had seen her worth beyond her scars. The man who had saved her, not just from death, but from a life of loneliness and fear. The man who had never once regretted his choice.